It is a profound and unsettling tragedy that, even after half a century of devotion and public life, the most critical decisions shaping a person's existence can still take place strictly behind closed doors. There was never an initial intention to drag these private affairs into the open air, yet the weight of recent developments demands that the truth finally be confronted and brought to an end. Queen Camilla had spent decades believing that the crown on her head had ultimately secured her unassailable position deep within Britain's most heavily guarded royal sphere. She operated under the assumption that her place at the center of the institution was cemented for the rest of her days. However, everything shifted in a single, earth-shattering moment when a sealed decree, bearing the absolute private authority of the late Prince Philip, was formally unsealed and executed. Through a single devastating command, every principal crown residence she had envisioned as part of her permanent royal future was abruptly placed entirely beyond her reach. The iron gates of Buckingham Palace, the ancient stone towers of Windsor Castle, the sweeping Highland estate of Balmoral, and the winter retreat of Sandringham were no longer merely shut against her. They had been deliberately and legally locked to deny her independent control. The atmosphere inside Clarence House turned instantly cold when Camilla's private secretary began reading the document aloud. She sat motionless, having entered the room expecting to receive routine confirmation that her permanent private apartments at Windsor Castle were finally cleared for occupation and final styling. Instead, the solemn cadence of her secretary's voice delivered a staggering revelation. Prince Philip's long-dormant directive had been activated, systematically stripping her of any rights to permanent residence, private suites, or independent domestic authority across all crown properties. To fully understand the severity of this mandate, one must recognize the strict legal framework governing crown residences. These historic properties are held strictly in trust for the official work and continuity of the reigning monarchy itself. They are not personal family assets that a sitting king can simply hand out or assign based on private affection. This critical institutional distinction instantly transformed the late Duke of Edinburgh's decree from a bitter family insult into an absolute, binding institutional order. As the secretary read through the document, his voice began to tremble halfway down the first page. Camilla lifted her gaze, fixing him with a sharp look, and ordered him to read every single word. Each successive sentence only served to tighten the legal net around her position. The terms were exceptionally precise and brutally restrictive. She was permitted to visit these historic estates. She could attend official state functions, gather with the family for traditional holidays, and occupy rooms on a temporary basis whenever explicit public duty required her presence. What she could never do, however, was claim these royal palaces as her personal domain, establish a permanent household staff within their walls, or dictate how their private living quarters would be allocated or modified. Having spent a lifetime fighting her way to the absolute peak of the royal hierarchy, Camilla was now forced to confront an invisible, impenetrable barrier placed around the very buildings that symbolized her ultimate achievement. King Charles sat nearby, watching the color drain from his wife's face as her usual composure collapsed into sheer disbelief. Desperate to mitigate the damage before the situation spiraled into an irreversible domestic crisis, Charles reached across the table to retrieve the document. He hoped to slow down the reading and process the legal implications in private, but Camilla immediately pulled the papers back toward herself, holding them tight. Then came the damning question that the king had been dreading ever since the seal was broken. Precisely how long had his father been orchestrating this plan behind his back? Charles offered no immediate defense, and his heavy silence spoke volumes. His inability to act stemmed from the absolute nature of the decree itself. Because the directive explicitly differentiated between constitutional crown property and the private estates personal to the sovereign, Charles could not simply issue an executive royal command to erase his father's orders. To do so would require him to openly challenge Philip's legal conditions before the senior royal trustees, the high-ranking officials legally bound to safeguard the monarchy's long-term assets and historical continuity. Turning to the bottom of the final page, Camilla discovered a distinct handwritten instruction pennied directly beneath the formal legal text. The note asserted in no uncertain terms that no future royal marriage, regardless of title or standing, could automatically grant control over residences reserved strictly for the sovereign, the direct line of succession, or national ceremonial duty. The handwriting was unmistakable in its clarity and resolve. These words were not written in a fit of sudden temper. They were calculated, deliberate, and cold. Just as the devastating reality of the text was settling in, the secretary noticed a glaring inconsistency in the document's structure. The sequential numbering was broken, revealing that a critical second page was missing from the file. Access to this second sheet had been restricted to an elite circle of just 3 individuals: King Charles, Princess Anne, and Prince William. As the king stared in silence at the empty gap in the folder, Camilla demanded that the hidden page be produced without a moment's delay. Before anyone in the room could move to respond, the heavy wooden door opened. Princess Anne walked into the room unannounced, carrying a heavy black archival case. She placed the case directly onto the center table, keeping one hand firmly planted on its lid. Camilla immediately declared that the fraudulent decree would be overturned by royal authority, but the Princess Royal remained entirely unbothered by the threat. Anne calmly replied that her father had fully anticipated those exact words and had carefully built measures to ensure his directive would hold firm. Before Camilla could even begin to organize a legal or administrative challenge, she was forced to stand before the 3 people whose long-term futures Prince Philip had explicitly protected at her direct expense. While the decree was drafted in the sterile terminology of property rights, estate management, and constitutional succession, its immediate impact was deeply, painfully human. For Camilla, the document felt like a final, devastating rejection from a patriarch whose full acceptance she had spent decades trying to secure. For Charles, it reopened an agonizing personal dilemma that had plagued his entire adult life, the painful conflict between private love and public duty. For William and Anne, it imposed an immense institutional responsibility. They were left with an agonizing choice: either enforce Philip's final command to safeguard the future of the crown, or step in to protect the fragile dignity of the reigning king's wife. Camilla kept her eyes locked on the black archival case, while Anne remained standing motionless beside it. The initial shock of the first page had stripped away her sense of security, but the deliberate assembly of family members around the table made the betrayal feel far deeper. Her title of Queen Consort guaranteed her ceremonial status, public deference, and global visibility, yet the decree drew an uncompromising line precisely where her real influence ended. She could represent the British monarchy inside its most breathtaking staterooms, yet she was permanently barred from possessing true authority over the private quarters where the institution's future would actually be decided. In the realm of royalty, true power is rarely measured by public crowns alone. It is defined by direct access, household management, and the undisputed right to belong without ever having to ask for permission. When the other senior royals stepped back to allow the king and queen a moment of privacy, Charles faced the painful task of confronting his wife's growing despair. Camilla looked at him directly, asking if he had known all along that his father never truly trusted her to hold authority within the institution. Unable to meet her gaze, Charles meticulously smoothed the edges of the document on the table before offering a response. He quietly admitted that Prince Philip had always operated under the firm conviction that physical spaces, the actual stone buildings of the monarchy, were the ultimate guardians of its future. By binding crown properties to strict succession rules rather than personal preference, his father had deliberately created a framework designed to outlast any individual reign. This reality forced the king to confront the very rift he had spent decades trying to close. While his private devotion belonged entirely to his wife, the historic palaces belonged to the nation and the crown itself. The explanation offered Camilla no comfort. She reminded Charles of the immense personal sacrifices she had made over the decades, the endless waves of public hostility she had weathered, and the continuous demand that she prove her unyielding loyalty to the royal family. Now, having finally taken her seat beside him on the throne, she was being informed that her presence within the royal residences remained entirely conditional. Her voice strained as she asked whether genuine love had ever held any real value within the machinery of the royal court, leaving Charles with no words strong enough to pierce the heavy silence that followed. Prince William stood nearby, acutely aware of his father's distress, yet he deliberately chose not to move toward the disputed document. His mind drifted back to a private conversation in which Prince Philip had sternly warned him that short-term emotional considerations must never be allowed to reshape the permanent inheritance of the monarchy. William recognized the immediate cruelty of the decree, but he understood the cold logic behind its creation. If a single marriage could redefine the long-term residential rights of the sovereign's working properties, every future succession risked becoming a chaotic renegotiation driven by personal influence rather than established duty. Princess Anne then unlocked the archival case, pulling out the documentation that revealed the decree's enforcement structure. Philip had officially designated his daughter as the primary guardian of the order, charging her with the explicit duty to ensure that no amount of emotional pressure, royal authority, or private bargaining could ever dismantle its provisions. In this institutional role, Anne was tasked with upholding her father's mandate long after he was gone. She made it clear to Camilla that this assignment was not a position of personal pride, but a heavy obligation she had accepted prior to the Duke's passing. Furthermore, the document revealed that Prince William had been named co-guardian, meaning his explicit written consent was legally required before Camilla could ever be granted even a single permanent private suite within any primary crown residence. As Camilla scanned the supporting schedules for legal loopholes, her eyes repeatedly caught the name of Catherine, the Princess of Wales. The recurring references made Prince Philip's intent undeniably clear. The decree was not constructed merely to restrict one woman's domestic control, but to permanently fortify another woman's future against internal court politics. The origins of this elaborate safeguard traced back to a tense, hidden incident at Windsor Castle years earlier, an event the palace had kept quietly buried. The decree had not originated from routine legal counsel or dusty constitutional precedent. It was sparked during a bitter evening at Windsor when a sharp family dispute exposed a vulnerability Philip refused to ignore. What others present at the dinner had brushed off as a temporary domestic argument became, in Philip's mind, a clear warning sign regarding the future governance of the royal households. From that night forward, he ceased viewing Camilla simply as Charles's devoted partner and began viewing her growing influence as a potential constitutional risk to the direct line of succession. Prior to that evening, the Duke had already spent months studying how royal apartments, administrative offices, and household staff allocations were managed during a transition between reigns. To a pragmatic figure like Philip, these physical arrangements were not minor domestic details. Crown residences operated as functional institutions, and whoever held control over their private spaces possessed the power to regulate access to the monarch, influence household appointments, and quietly marginalize the standing of the direct heirs. The simmering tension had finally boiled over during a private dinner at Windsor following a succession planning meeting. Camilla had openly questioned a proposal that sought to permanently reserve a major residential wing of Windsor Castle for William, Catherine, and their children. She argued that decisions of such magnitude should be deferred until Charles took the throne, characterizing the advance reservation as an unnecessary preemption of the next monarch's authority. Philip quietly set down his glass and asked if she truly considered the direct heirs to be mere guests within their own family inheritance. Camilla countered that Charles had already sacrificed far too much throughout his life and should not begin his reign constrained by conditions imposed by the previous generation. She insisted the incoming king deserved complete freedom to organize his royal households without being shadowed by outdated restrictions. Throughout the exchange, Catherine remained entirely silent, though her discomfort was evident as she subtly adjusted her chair away from the table. Philip noted her quiet withdrawal, just as he noticed William glancing protectively toward his wife before lowering his eyes, determined to avoid an open confrontation between his father's immediate wishes and his own family's long-term security. That subtle interaction convinced Philip that the debate was no longer about physical rooms, but about whether the future king and queen could have their standing made subject to another's favor. Later that same night, Philip summoned a trusted private secretary and dictated the foundational clause of what would become his secret decree. Documented in his private records, the directive stated unequivocally that no consort outside the direct line of succession could ever displace, diminish, or impose conditions upon the residential standing of an heir. Shortly thereafter, Philip confronted Charles directly, asking if he would stand up for William's household if Camilla ever sought to expand her domestic control. When Charles replied that, as king, he could not allow old family anxieties to dictate his marriage, Philip heard an alarming lack of resolve. Before dawn broke, the Duke expanded his restrictions from that single Windsor apartment to encompass every primary crown residence across the United Kingdom. Years after those quiet dictates were committed to paper, the cold reality of Prince Philip's foresight returned to the halls of Windsor. Camilla found herself seated across from Princess Anne and Prince William, the decree spread between them like an unyielding legal verdict. With no palace aides, media advisors, or formal statements to cushion the impact, the air in the room was dense with decades of unspoken tension. Pushing the document away, Camilla bitterly accused the guardians of utilizing a dead man's memory to systematically humiliate her. The challenge was monumental. She either had to accept a restricted, temporary guest status within the royal properties or launch a formal appeal through the Royal Household's Property Council. Yet a public challenge would inevitably force Charles to choose between defending his wife and upholding his father's final institutional command, exposing a catastrophic rift at the very heart of the contemporary monarchy. Turning her focus toward William, Camilla argued that enforcing such rigid constraints would inflict far more pain on his father than on her, effectively forcing the king to watch his wife be treated as a transient visitor inside the official residences of his own reign. William met her gaze with measured composure, explaining that his father's emotional distress could never be used as a justification to dismantle structural protections designed to preserve the long-term integrity of the crown. His words were devoid of anger, reflecting a profound institutional discipline that prioritized the stability of future generations over present comfort. When Camilla suggested that Philip had failed to grasp the realities of a modern royal family, Princess Anne stepped forward. The Princess Royal noted that her father understood the dynamics of the court with incredible precision, enough to foresee the exact individuals sitting in that room, the arguments that would be deployed, and the intense pressure Charles would inevitably face. Anne then retrieved the missing second page from the archival case. The newly revealed clauses were uncompromising. Any active effort to pressure the sovereign into overriding the decree would automatically trigger even stricter administrative limitations, and Camilla was explicitly barred from directing major renovations, managing household appointments, or dictating space allocations across Buckingham Palace, Windsor, Balmoral, or Sandringham without prior written consent from the guardians. As voices rose in heated argument, King Charles entered the room. Rather than immediately rushing to his wife's side, he looked to his son and inquired whether Philip had left behind a personal message explaining why these restrictions had to be made absolute. Charles took the sealed letter into an adjoining room to read it in solitude. In the personal note, the late Duke expressed deep concern that Charles's intense personal devotion to Camilla might unconsciously compromise his judgment regarding the permanent rights of the succession. Philip emphasized that while personal affection is fleeting, the physical assets supporting the direct line of inheritance must remain absolute. Brooding over the letter, the king recognized the sheer impossibility of his position. The legal structures tied to the crown estate, combined with the pre-signed undertakings overseen by the trustees, meant that no single individual, not even the reigning monarch, could unilaterally overturn the framework. Emerging from the room, Charles made his tragic, definitive decision. To avoid a constitutional scandal that would shatter public confidence in the monarchy, he would not contest his father's decree. The systemic continuity of the crown had to take precedence over private dynamic. The immediate execution of that decision manifested with stark simplicity. A set of master keys to the Windsor apartments was quietly collected, signaling the immediate suspension of Camilla's permanent residential projects across all major Crown estates. Staff members assigned to her personal office were informed that their roles could not be converted into permanent posts within official Crown properties, effectively dismantling the independent court network she had envisioned. Furthermore, a private suite at Balmoral that Camilla had selected for her personal use was formally reassigned to William and Catherine's household. Before departing Windsor, Camilla requested a private, one-on-one meeting with Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Free from the presence of lawyers, guardians, or palace officials, the two women met behind closed doors. Catherine acknowledged the sheer difficulty of the situation, clarifying that she had never sought to diminish Camilla's standing or seize control of royal spaces. She explained that her sole concern had always been securing a stable, undisputed foundation for her children, ensuring their position as direct heirs would never be rendered vulnerable to shifting household politics. Recognizing that an ongoing internal feud would ultimately destroy the public standing of the entire family, the two women reached a quiet, crucial compromise. Catherine agreed to fully support the creation of a permanent, privately owned sanctuary for Camilla located at one of the king's personal estates, a home completely independent of the Crown estate system, where no legal decree or guardian could ever challenge her authority. In return, Camilla agreed to accept the boundaries established for the official Crown residences and refrain from launching any public or legal challenges against the succession framework. When news of the internal arrangements inevitably leaked to the public, the national discourse was swift and intense. Media outlets framed the situation as Prince Philip's final, decisive act of institutional stewardship, while commentators debated the cruelty versus the constitutional necessity of the legal order. The public narrative settled when Camilla and Catherine made a scheduled, unified public appearance together. Their quiet solidarity demonstrated to the world that the royal family had chosen dignified restraint over chaotic infighting. Ultimately, Camilla did not reclaim the grand suites of Buckingham Palace or the ancient apartments of Windsor Castle. The boundaries established by Prince Philip remained entirely firm. Yet, in accepting the strict limitations imposed upon her official position, she achieved a different kind of quiet victory. By choosing not to tear down the institutional walls that restricted her, Queen Camilla transformed what could have been a devastating personal humiliation into a display of remarkable resilience, proving that true dedication to the Crown requires placing the permanence of the institution far above one's personal desires.